So good morning. I'm really looking forward to talking about how the innovation landscape is changing. To say today that everywhere around us we have an explosion of digital technologies would be a mild understatement. The pace of that innovation is changing more rapidly before. And as we speak to companies and organizations out there, we say that that pace of innovation and those digital technologies are changing companies from their strategy, they're evolving their operating model, they're changing effectively how they need to deal with support functions. New opportunities and challenges exist on data management now, and IT, and even the landscape around how we adjust and deal with people. All of that impacted by innovation. In that changing landscape, there's a lot of comments and conversations around what is the need for strategy, how can it be synchronized and connected to innovation? Is it even separable from each other? Point number one. And point number two, are we really going after innovation or are we trying to drive towards value? The combination of these two questions we're going to explore in our panel, and I'd like to kick that off with asking Professor Rita McGrath to introduce herself and to provide us a brief overview from her perspective.
Sure, thank you. I actually don't have slides, but...
okay.
Well, good morning. Yeah, pleasure to be here. I'll just stand over here so you can see me because I'm very short. So I think the first observation I'd make about innovation today is that increasingly you can't really talk about strategy without talking about innovation. And as we're moving into a world where competitive advantages last for shorter and shorter periods of time, innovation becomes the process by which you renew your transient competitive advantages. And I think that's a real shift in how we used to think about strategy. You know, when I started in the field of strategy some years back, I was one of the lonely few kind of working on innovation, and those of us working on innovation were sort of huddled in the corner for warmth, and all the cool kids doing strategy were doing industry analysis and, you know, rank order of entry and that kind of thing. And in the intervening years, what we've seen is that strategy and innovation have actually become much more integral to one another. And I think the new wrinkle, and perhaps what this panel will get into a bit, is that increasingly, if you can't talk about strategy without talking about innovation, you can't really talk about innovation without talking about digital. And digital has really gone through several evolutions, in my view. The first thing that happened with digital was the easy stuff, you know, just digitizing what was sort of analog and easy, so text, news, that kind of thing. Then it moved into digital accoutrements to conventional business models, so conventional business products. So things like the digital camera would be the next wave. And now what we're seeing is digital is fundamentally influencing business models. So we're starting to see born digital firms taking on born analog firms in a way that has not really been presented before. And specifically with regard to digital, there's a point I'd like to make about what exactly makes it different than other kinds of innovation that we've seen in the past. And for that, I'll go all the way back to Ronald Coase and the theory of the firm. And the old line was, why do you need firms? Like, why bother, right? And the answer was, you need firms when transactions are expensive, when you can't really gauge the value of the good or service that's being traded, when there's the risk of opportunism, and so forth. And you're probably all familiar with that theory. Well, one of the things digital has done has eliminated a lot of those obstacles to market-based contracting. So what we're finding is in more and more parts of the digital economy, the digital ecosystem, we're able to create markets where we never could before. And that is a fundamental shift in how you need to think about what you do in your organization. So if it can be developed in a market, it probably will be. And that's where I think some of the more forward-thinking firms are really saying, hey, if it can be digitized, it will be. If it can be made into a market, it will be. And if we're not going to do it for ourselves, someone else will. And I think that's where the cutting edge of innovation really is today. It's this digital creation of entirely new business models that we never saw before. And you'll hear later today about Klockner. I'm a huge fan of what they're doing in the digital space. And having the courage to say, we've got, a very traditional industry, but we're going to be brave enough to really take it into the future in a way that many incumbents would never think of. So I'll leave you with the following couple of thoughts, and then we'll turn it over to the panel. Innovation today, central to strategy. You can't really think about strategy without thinking about innovation. And one of the things I hope we'll probe in the course of today and the Drucker Forum to come is how do we get past innovation theater? You all know what that's like, right? You put people on an airplane, you send them off to Silicon Valley, right? They ride the Google bike, they get their picture taken next to the Facebook sign. And that's sort of innovation. But it doesn't really land. It doesn't really transform into business process. So we need to get much more serious about what innovation really is. So I think that's point number one. Point number two is the true consequence of digital is that it's making markets where we used to have firms. And that is a fundamental shift in the assumptions that many of our businesses are founded on. And I think the third thing, and I'll talk about this more later in the Drucker Forum, is we have time. We have time. Digital feels like a tsunami, but it's been building up very slowly over a long period of time. And therefore, there's something strategic that we can begin to do about it. So I'm hoping to explore those concepts with you today and throughout the Drucker Forum. Thank you, Julie.
Rita, thank you very much. Thank you. We're going to shift gears a little bit. And Curtis, I'm going to ask you if you could go next and provide us an overview of how you think about innovation. I know you have some slides. I don't know if you want to sit or stand, but I'm happy to provide you both. Curtis, maybe you could give a little background on yourself. Give a little background about yourself. Talk to you about what you've accomplished. You have a tremendous...
So I was CEO of SRI International. Some of you know it as Stanford Research Institute for 16 years. When I went to SRI, it had been failing for 20 years. And we did the things I'm going to talk about, and when I retired, we grew the organization 3.5 times, and we created many tens of billions of dollars of new economic value with innovations such as high-definition television, Intuitive Surgical, that by itself is a $50 billion company, and Siri, which you all know, on the iPhone. And what was interesting is we took the same people who'd been failing for 20 years, and they became incredibly productive researchers. So today I work with the U.S. government on improving innovative performance, and that's really the subject of my talk. But it comes from all this experience working around the world, creating major innovations with companies, startups, and others. Okay, that enough?
Perfect.
Okay.
Perfect.
So I want to talk to you about a shift that we think is necessary from entrepreneurship to value creation. And I think it's a shift that can create a profound improvement in the innovative results and society. I always love to show this at the Drucker Forum. It's Peter Drucker is one of his most famous quotes. Because the purpose of a business is to create a customer, the business enterprise has two and only two basic functions: marketing and innovation. Everything else is cost. So, to all the executives, I want to talk to you about a shift that we think is necessary from entrepreneurship to value creation. And I think it's a shift that can create a profound improvement in the innovative results and society. I always love to show this at the Drucker Forum. It's Peter Drucker is one of his most famous quotes. Because the purpose of a business is to create a customer, the business enterprise has two and only two basic functions: marketing and innovation. Everything else is cost. So, to all the executives here, your number one job is basically innovation, value creation. How many people here train all of their staff to be value creators? Raise your hand. Okay, so last year I asked the audience at Drucker, I got 5 hands up out of 500 leaders in management and innovation. It's not taught. So how about the performance we have? We all know about Nokia and Kodak, who rapidly went away. If you're a listed company on the stock market, you last for 10 years before you go away. Almost all university tech transfer loses money, with a few exceptions when they have a drug. Most incubators in America lose money. National labs struggle to create any value from their technology. And even where I am in Venture City, Silicon Valley, 70% of venture capitalists lose money every year. 5% make 95% of the returns. Imagine. And in the United States, which is really horrifying, median income has not increased since 1970. I do not think we ought to be proud of what we have done over the last 30 years. Now, my question to the group here is entrepreneurship the right focus? Even with 300 university entrepreneurial programs, 6,000 professors, 1,600 incubators, and billions of dollars of U.S. value, government value, being poured into entrepreneurship since the early 1980s, ventures of scale, that is to say, not mom and pops, these are companies that can actually grow to make a contribution, have dropped by 30%. Now, if you go into those incubators or tech transfer organizations or even big companies, and you actually go through a drill and figure out what they're doing, we don't decide this, they decide this. The projects they're working on that would have any value if they completed varies between 0 and about 30 or 40%. The average is certainly not much better than 20%. In other words, what most companies work on is waste. It has no value for the company or for society. And we see that everywhere we go around the world. That's where I think the problem is. You have to create value before you can be an entrepreneur. If we create more value, we'll create more entrepreneurial opportunities. At SRI, with 2,300 staff, who essentially none were entrepreneurs, we never taught entrepreneurship, but they were value creators, and we created one multi-billion-dollar business after another by focusing on value first and then entrepreneurship. The U.S. government has been taking notice of this. We just completed a major study, a 2-year study, documenting the limited performance, that most of the practices that are being used around the world are outdated. We need a paradigm shift. There is a paradigm shift possible, but we have to focus on value creation first. You start with first things first. And you might want to be interested in reading the report. So what are the factors that are limiting performance? Well, mostly people don't focus on the larger opportunities that they have. They focus on incremental things that they can do as opposed to things that would actually make a difference. They have no common value creation language. They don't understand the concepts. Walk into any company and have people write down the definition of innovation on a Post-it note and see what you see. We have never been in a team where they agreed. Right from the start, there's confusion. If you don't have shared mental frameworks for how to be a value creator, obviously collaboration suffers. Collaboration is usually terrible. In universities, it's horrible, as we all know. And people are using inappropriate methodologies. So teaching people how to fill out 12 venture charts, or the Heilmeyer criteria, or other ideas, is premature, actually confusing, until you've created value. Value creation is where everything starts. So recommendations were made by the National Academy. We need to teach our employees what value creation is. There ought to be a playbook. And use best practices. For example, how do you identify important global opportunities? How do you use core frameworks for thinking about what innovation is about? So to me, the most important one is the fundamental definition of the value proposition. I think this is the most important single concept. If you can get an organization to do it, it will transform your organization. 4 questions. What's the important customer need? What's the approach for the offering and the business model? What are the benefits per cost or the value of the idea, and how does that compare to the competition? 4 questions. They're all interconnected. If you change one, they all change. More complicated methodologies are exactly the wrong thing to do in the beginning. Having personally created innovations that are worth billions, we have never gone to a full business plan before we could answer these questions. And it would take us years to answer these questions. They're really hard to answer. More complicated systems do not work with real people. And we have a learning process that we use to help people get the answers they need faster, which I'll talk about later in the conference. And just one example of a best practice is, because teams don't understand these things, the best practice is to hold a workshop at the start of all new initiatives to make sure everybody does have common language and frameworks for value creation. And we're asked by the National Science Foundation, the biggest funding agency in the United States, to create a playbook for them, and we just delivered that to them. So in summary, I think if you look at the data, you'd agree that today's results are not what we want. And the problem starts at the beginning. It starts with a poor development of value that matters. Entrepreneurship comes second. And there's a paradigm improvement, possible improvement if we do that. And that's what we're working on. So we hope you'll consider, you'll be able to see the results we've produced online, and to use a playbook that encapsulates these ideas. And also the fact that we're in the innovation economy. And the most essential skill you can give your people is to be a value creator. If you cannot be a value creator in today's world, the chances are you're going to become obsolete at some point and maybe never work again. So I'd encourage you to give these skills to your staff. We're now working with major universities in the United States who are now teaching these skills to project-based teams. And I believe we're on the verge of creating a whole a suite of universities across America where projects will add to projects the ability to be value creators. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Georg, could I invite you? I know you have a totally different perspective in terms of scaling up innovation. Could you introduce yourself and provide some words of advice for our panel?
Absolutely. So good morning, everybody. I'm actually I think the only Viennese on this panel. So I'm very proud to be here in the hometown or in the birthplace of Peter Drucker. So basically we created our company, TTTech, more than 20 years ago out of very basic research, so very basic science out of the Technical Institute of Vienna. We also had a cooperation with SRI for a very long time with John Rushby, and some of our engineers have been with your institute as resident engineers. And we were working on digital networks and technologies that make our Internet and Ethernet technologies much more robust, much more reliable, and that we can deploy them from airspace and spacecraft down to cars and different activities. And I'm one of the co-founders of the company. My father, who was a professor, was kind of the scientific father, and together with my executive board member, Stefan Poledner, who is also more on the technical side, we tried to scale innovation. So what does innovation mean for me? First of all, I really liked what you said before about the topic of marketing and innovation being, for me, different parts of the same coin. So if you get the business side, the marketing side, and the innovation side right, at the end of the day, you have then the coin where you make money, because they go very closely together. And for me, innovation is about making money on different markets. So what Rita said about Born Digital, it also comes with Born Global, and that you, from the start, if you want to scale or if you want to bring innovation to the market, you have to have an impact and you have to scale the company. And now comes in the European or the Viennese perspective that we don't like to scale. We have our niche markets. We are very conservative. We have Franz Josef here. So we like to have our niche market, we like to make good money, but scaling is always a risk. Yeah? And if you take in risk, you have to take in equity, and you have to take in people that are not part of your closer network. And of course, you have to go to foreign countries, and you have to expand. Yeah? So we went in our second year. We went to Japan. We went to the US because the automotive market is, of course, focused around the big centers of the automotive OEMs. And so we found out that scaling is pretty tough. Yeah? So that basically to combine this business aspect with the innovation aspect is pretty tough, especially out of Europe, because we don't really have markets for technology. We have more markets for products. So you have to transfer a technology to a product, and then only with the product you can scale. It's not that easy. At least it hasn't been that easy 20 years ago or 15 years ago to scale with technology. The good news is this is now changing. Yeah? So we have a completely different perspective on digital technologies also in Europe. And I believe we are just seeing the creation of a technology market environment in Europe that big companies, and I always like to talk about the automotive OEMs because that's where we spend most of our time, they suddenly realize that to have tech companies as their partners and friends, and also local tech companies that are established in the region, gives them a competitive advantage to compete on the global markets. So suddenly we see a change in perception that technology and software, and we are mostly now a software company, is seen as being something which creates value for them if they buy software and if they don't just buy engineering. And suddenly by this change of attitude, by this change of perception, suddenly a value creation or a business opportunity arises. Yeah? And if you look at the famous book from Peter Drucker on innovation entrepreneurship, yeah, he mentioned a few things how innovation can create. Yeah? And I think they're still valid in 2018. I think one is that he's told us that you have to look if there's a market or industry needs change. So if there's a change in a basic way, what people want to see and want to take, it always provides a big opportunity for innovation. And if we now look at this huge topic of semi-autonomous cars and autonomous systems overall, yeah, it only the market that this creates, it comes about because there are different changes happening in the marketplace. First of all, we have new consumers that want to spend more time on the internet and want to spend more time in being connected. So this means they provide a need to the car makers to give them the safe technologies that they can still ride in the car and still basically be connected in the digital world. And this change is a complete disruption in a very traditional market in Europe. The car industry has given us a lot of the wealth and the value in Europe in the last 100 years. The European car industry, especially the premium brands, they have been leading the global markets. And now with this change of this huge market, it's also a huge opportunity for companies to scale and to become technology companies in this market. And actually predictions are that the automotive mobility market will double in value in the next 15, 20 years because of all these connected services coming on top of this basic mobility service that cars, of course, provide and always have provided. And this now creates a huge innovation and scaling opportunity for entrepreneurs. But the question is the business model there? And also, this is also what I liked about your topic, that you need to think about the business creation and the value creation, because only if those customers accept that you are paid for software, you are paid for technology, then you create a big business and you can create a big undertaking. And that's, for me, I think very inspiring at the moment. Also, I think what we see, that there are a lot of things happening which are unexpected. And I would say, for me, which is the most unexpected, happened yesterday, actually. One of the most unexpected things is that Siemens, the big grand European tech company, agreed together with Rockwell Automation and Schneider and Bosch Rexroth and other big players to create a common standard for the industrial internet communication for the industrial machines. Yeah? You know, in the last 25 years, we had all these different vertical solutions like Profinet and Ethernet IP and EtherCAT and all these different flavors. And now the industry said this common standard, if we want to go to the industrial internet, we need to have a common standard. And suddenly the European companies are joining global standards at the beginning of the value creation and not of the end. In the last 15, 20 years, the US have always been leading those international digital standards with the IEEE and with other activities. And actually, when we started out, we went to Cisco to convince Cisco to get into these markets. But then basically Cisco is too far away from the industrial markets to really be a solution provider on the industrial space. So we then went back to Europe together with Cisco and tried to win the European and American companies to work together on a global standard. And this means that if we are moving early in certain markets, and if we see the change in the market shift before it really happens, I think there's a huge chance also for European companies to create digital standards. And I think if we manage to create digital standards out of Europe, we will create a lot of companies with a lot of value, and we can much better compete globally. So I'm really a friend of these transatlantic corporations. We have a lot of them in our company. In our auto company, we have investors from the US, like Samsung and GE Ventures, with investors from Europe, like Audi and Infineon, and they work together with us as the technology innovator. And I think this model of global corporations and partnerships to create value together and to scale innovation is becoming much more important, because I don't believe that we have too much time. I think that in certain shifts in the market, we will see winner takes it all, or winner takes it most of the market's economies. And if you come with a standard as a second or a third, it will be much more difficult for you to create then a global impact. And again, to sum up, scaling for me is the essential part of the innovation game. Scaling means in the digital world partnerships, global partnerships, and the willingness to risk, to take calculated risks in order to be able to set global standards first and to be able to win in those highly competitive winner-takes-it-all or most markets.
Fantastic. Georg, thank you very much for your comments. I think three very interesting perspectives. I want to offer two very quick comments. My first comment is Dr. Hammenhäuser has been caught up in London, I'm afraid. He'll be joining us a little later in the day, but not in enough time for the panel, so I do send his apologies. I do want to remind you all to ask questions as we go on the iPad, and I'm happy to take those questions. I will also pass a hand mic for those later as we go. So just to kick off the discussion, I thought we had really three interesting perspectives. And Rita, I'm going to start the first question to you. With all your experience in advising CEOs, your academic work, amazing around innovation and your thoughts, want to understand your primary thesis is the new entrepreneurship and innovation will be driven by making effectively the markets of the future. We no longer have to wait, we need to make the markets. How does that change the definition of entrepreneurship and what's needed from innovation if they're actually defining new markets? Do you see a change there?
Well, I think the entrepreneurs have always, to some extent, made new markets. It's perceiving those market needs in a getting a really different flash of insight. I wanted to first comment on Georg's presentation. I was at a fascinating lunch yesterday with a group of entrepreneurs, Viennese entrepreneurs, believe it or not, and they made an interesting comment. They said the U.S. has the internet, but Europe has the things. I thought that was great. And I think your observations kind of echo that. So back to your question, I think one of the things we're really seeing today is a radical shift in the definition of where competition takes place. And we used to think competition was mainly involved in industries, which by definition means something got born, developed, shook out, had time for some sort of stability to emerge around a class of competitive spaces. And today what I think we're much more seeing is competition in industries that are very blurred. I call it competition in arenas, and I'll talk more about this later in the forum. But briefly, I think when you think about new markets, you're really thinking about entirely new classes of Clayton Christensen would call them jobs to be done, right? New kinds of jobs that get done in very, very kind of different ways. And I think when you think about markets in that way, it really changes the definition of how you compete because it shifts the boundaries. So a great example of this is in the world of men's shaving. Who would have thought that was a radical, kind of arena? It's been around for a long time. But if you look at the new entrants and upstarts that have really redefined that category, the direct-to-consumer operations like Dollar Shave Club and Harry's that have sort of said, hey, why do you need retailers? Why do you need this whole distribution infrastructure that grew up over decades and decades and decades around shaving? Why don't you just tell us what you want? You subscribe, we'll send you a razor once a month, and boom, you're done. No looking for a retail person to unlock the razor fortress and all that kind of hassle. And I mean, that's a very trivial kind of innovation, if you want to think about it. But on the other hand, it's a really massive innovation. I mean, it completely changes the supply chain. It changes the assumptions. It changes the key metrics. Everything about how you get that job of getting shaved done shifts in that world. So is that a brand new market? Not really. Is it a completely new way of looking at a need? Yes, I think it is. And so that's a really interesting example to me of, and again, it's digital, right, makes this possible. So if you think about why an organization like that can exist and what it did to established incumbents like Gillette, Procter & Gamble's Gillette, what allowed it to be? Well, you had YouTube, right? And in the beginning, nobody took YouTube seriously. I mean, come on, YouTube cat videos, really? But if you think about it, if you wanted to get a video to millions and millions of people 30 years ago, you'd have to be a media company. You'd have to be Time Warner or the BBC or something like that. Facebook, if you wanted to get a message to 2 billion people, you would have to be like the postal service of 15 countries combined. And Amazon Web Services, right? Before you had that, you would have to actually buy servers and all this stuff. So we see these shifts in what's possible that are enabled, by new technologies, by digital in many cases, which allows these new business models to emerge. And I think that's where a lot of the innovation is going to happen today.
In the future. That makes sense. But how does that connect, Kurt, to the concept of value creation? If you take that example now around men shaving and effectively cutting out the middle market, reducing the supply chain, that's creating true value for the consumer. Is that where you think that's the tick the box that you've got to demonstrate that value in order to be successful, and every innovation needs to map up to how they're creating additional value either for the consumer, the end consumer, or the next person in the chain, I would say?
Well, first off, I call these white spaces. These markets have always been there, and the whole goal of business is to identify these white spaces and to do it before the other person does, where you deliver compelling value, not just incremental value, not 10%, but a factor of 2 or 10 times. So if you want to compete in the global market, you've got to do something significant, and you want to be in a white space that's a potentially big market where you can get started and where you have a competitive advantage. You don't want to be in a commodity business. You want to find these areas. So then as soon as you say that, which I think is pretty obvious to this group, as soon as you say that, then the question is, well, how do you systematically find them?
Yeah.
What's your process for finding them? Because they don't just show up magically. Steve Jobs is obviously an exemplar. He bought Siri from us. We spun out Siri. 3 months later, he shows up and knocking on our door and saying, I want to buy your company. We didn't want to sell it. But, he could be kind of a jerky guy, but he could also be really persuasive. So the team eventually agreed. We sold it to him. We called up IBM, Google, Facebook. We called up everybody, and we couldn't find another vice president who understood what we'd done. What's different about Steve Jobs? Every Monday, he did basically what I described in his own way. Every Monday, he spent a day basically synthesizing information that was fed up to him, and at the end of Monday, it went down. Up, down, up, down, up, down. What other vice president does that? What other CEO does that? Essentially none. Steve Jobs had actually figured out those white spaces. He had a process to find those white spaces. And that's when he saw us, he immediately called us up and bought the company. And these other companies who don't do this missed at least the entrance into that new white space. So we had a tremendous advantage in the beginning. So we had our process, the one I described, which was continuous iteration, very much like Steve Jobs, where we are asking, where are these white spaces? We had a process to do that. And we were able to find our fair share of them. Every 2 or 3 years, we found another unicorn. Now, with 2,300 people. Some of you work for really big companies. If we can find unicorns one after the other, and obviously Steve Jobs found super unicorns, it's a process. It's a way of thinking. You don't identify them by accident. Here's an amazing thing. Almost all major innovations happen outside of established companies because they don't have a process like that. Why didn't Walmart develop Amazon? Why didn't GM create electric cars? Because they tend to take these big white spaces and bring them back into the company and basically destroy them. You need a separate process to identify those kinds of things. But if you do, I would claim this is absolutely the best time in the history of the world. There are white spaces in just about every market you can think of.
Can I build on that for one second?
Yeah, please, Rita.
So one of the companies I work with is the SAS Institute, which was big data before we knew what big data was. And Phil Goodnight and his management team meet every Tuesday afternoon, every Tuesday. And they invite the people working on innovation projects to give them an update on where they stand. Half a day, every week. And I mean, I work with a lot of leadership teams, and that level of commitment is something you rarely see to innovation. And just to build on Kurt's point.
So establish a process, drive some leadership commitment to do it. But does it take more than that? And George, I'm going to ask you, because you've got a lot of experience working with larger companies as well in terms of how do you drive that? Do you have to do what Kurt is suggesting, take it outside and incubate it, collaborate with the smaller to really get it done so you don't destroy value along the way?
Yeah, I look like a little bit to disagree because I think constructive confrontation is good for the panel. If you look what GM has been doing lately with GM Cruise, it's very unusual for the auto industry. It's very unusual for GM, and I think it's very unusual for the world. Yeah? I mean, they bought a very small team, Cruise Automation, in Silicon Valley. They invested, at least they said publicly, they will invest $1 billion in this team. Then they went to SoftBank, got I think another $2.5 billion, and then to Honda, another $2 billion. Now they have a small team and $5 billion in cash. I think it leveled a little bit the stock price of GM up. Yeah? So GM got more valuable by doing that, by committing so much money with partners. And they want to go roll out against Waymo. Basically, they go to San Francisco and want to roll out Get Cruise, so basically a ride-hailing service, in a very unusual, unconventional way, in driving scale at a massive speed. The Americans call it now blitzscaling, as I've learned last month when we got the new book got out, and I think the split scaling is something very important in those markets. Yeah? If you are late in those markets and others have taken the key positions, and I think that's the big difference from like 5 years ago. We worked with GM on the autonomy project from GM like 12, 14 years ago. It had a very nice, chassis, and we did the electronics for the chassis. It was all electric and all by wire and all digital, and it was super, super concept. We went to to all different auto fairs and showed it off. But it never really got traction because inside this organization, nobody was willing to commit so much money and so much personal credibility on such a risky attitude. So I think to the point, either you have a very strong leader like Steve Jobs, who is really pushing the organization through, or I think you have to create new organizational models, that you can scale and drive innovation outside of your existing, more process-driven and very disciplined core operations. Because I don't know if the GM Cruise will be successful. I think nobody knows. But at least they will make many attempts, and they will make many attacks. And the incumbents, they have to take time to fight them off in their existing organizations, and they have a new organization. So I think also innovation has a lot to do with organizational design and how you basically build up your entities. And what we do in TTTech with our group structure, we say we have different entities, with auto being the most important in terms of driving the safety platform for automation and autonomy. And we drive it out globally, and we take a lot of risks. But we have strong partnerships, and we try to leverage the risk. So when we go to China, we went to the biggest car maker, SAIC, and asked them, we came together, and we decided, okay, let's make a joint venture and drive this platform in China together. And they shall take the lead, and we are basically following. But it's very important to be in China with these platforms because the car industry is in China. There are 28 million cars being built in China. 7 million are built by SAIC and their joint ventures. And if you're not there, somebody else will take the market. And there is no question that you can wait. You have to commit resources, money, people, energy, attention on this venture, because if not, somebody else will take the market. So I think for me, value creation and scaling has a lot to do with also if you have the right organization and the right teams in place. And I believe you need to think also about this structure to make it work. And I think GM did a good move with GM Cruise.
Okay, I'm going to build on that because I saw Kurt nodding and wanting to get in there. But I'm going to take a question from the audience to build on it. They're asking, do you really think, and it builds, George, on what you said on organizational design, do you really think innovators and business leaders are really concerned about the world and driving innovation, or are they really driven by the valuation and quarterly returns?
It's a very tough question. Yeah, I think both, actually. I think there are different types of leaders. And if you follow Peter Drucker, and we are here to talk about good leadership and good management and good strategic management in particular. I think if you want to play digital in a Champions League, you have to understand the markets and you have to understand technology. And the CEO who doesn't understand markets and technology and who does not spend time with his innovators, engineers, his marketeers, his key accounts, and doesn't really understand the subject matter will fail sooner or later. Yeah? And in my opinion, this is why you cannot only look at the quarterly earnings and the valuation, but valuation is important because valuation creates facts. Yeah? If you attract money, and if you have a lot of money, the chances of winning are much higher than if you have small commitments of capital. So I think it's not an either-or question, it's an and question. You have to drive valuation to get the capital in, but you have to be driven on the longer term, because in a quarterly schedule, a quarterly sequence, you cannot create large markets because it takes longer to create markets, but you have to move fast.
So Rita, I'm going to build on that with a question from the audience. What do you think happens to the first mover advantage in this digital world?
That's a fascinating question because, you know, anytime I hear somebody say, oh, we have to be the first in this market, we have to be the biggest in this market, I get really nervous because a lot of times the assumptions underneath that statement don't apply. But as Georg said, we are seeing more and more markets where it is winner take all, because you have the first movers have the opportunity to establish the standards, and you've got the increasing importance of network effects, which means your offering is more valuable the more users are using it. And in that case, there is the possibility for lockout and competitive preemption. So it's really changed. I think this is something that's pretty new in the last 4 or 5 years, where if you'd asked me that question 5 years ago, I would have said, oh, don't be ridiculous. You know, second movers do just fine. And I think less and less that is something I can say with as much confidence as I would have at one point. Can I make one quick comment on the shareholder value thing?
Yeah, please.
You know, what I think we get mixed up with the quarter-by-quarter and shareholder value discussion is revenues, profits, stock prices are often a lagging indicator, right? They arise because something else happened first. And the thing that happened first is satisfied customers coming back, you know, growing your market and so forth. And so I think if we focus too much on the lagging indicator and not enough on the leading indicators, ultimately it's a negative spiral. And I think we forget that those things are an outcome, not a cause.
Okay, I'm going to shift the panel a little bit because Bill Fisher opened this up and talked about leadership and the aspect of leadership that's changing. And Kurt, I'm going to ask you, as you look at leadership in driving innovation, what were the values that you used in your teams to really put innovation front and center? And you talked a little bit about having a common language, but I'm sure it was much more than that. What else did you do to really drive that change?
Hard to know where to start. What I knew was if you didn't make innovative results inevitable, you were putting the company at risk. I knew that. You had to make the results you wanted inevitable. Now, inevitable is a big word, but it meant that there was a very systematic way to guarantee you would get the performance you wanted. I was motivated by a number of things. My company is in Silicon Valley. It's super expensive there. And it was obvious that we were not going to thrive the way we used to. We had to do things that really mattered to customers. So part of it is understanding your ecosystem and the kind of strategy you must have. And the second part of it was, well, how do you put that in place? And fortunately, I learned a lot of this. We tried everything. We read every book on innovation. Nothing worked. Nothing worked. That's where I was like a laboratory. And what we discovered is the most simple fundamental things were transformative. I mentioned the value proposition. That's a big deal to me, those 4 basic questions. And like Peter Drucker, they start out with the customer. What's the customer need? Now imagine an organization where everybody understands that every discussion starts with the customer. That one thing is transformative. Complicated systems won't do that. The 9 Six Sigma won't do that. But when everybody walks into the room knowing that there are 4 fundamental questions you always must answer, and it starts with one. So I knew that we had to create a management team that understood that and could put that in place. And that meant putting in processes that also where iteration and teamwork and collaboration would be part of it. So some people talk about servant CEOs. I was definitely a servant CEO, okay? I thought if I can empower the genius of our company, we could do anything. But if it depended on Kurt, the company was going to go away really fast.
Did you have to train your people?
We trained everybody. So I gave the first workshop on our strategy. Our strategy was to be the premier independent source of high-value innovations in the world. So step number 1 is you have to be the best at what you do. No excuses. We compete with everybody today. So that was I gave a talk about that. I gave a talk about our value creation process and how it was a gift for the employees, because if they mastered these things, they could work forever. And the third thing was about our values, our human values, respect, integrity, trust, those kind of things. And then all of our staff would go through extended workshops to learn the principles. So over time, it took years for this to happen, but over time, we collected a group of people where you'd walk in and you could have a really intelligent conversation about value creation, which, by the way, is almost incredibly rare. And part of my motivation, too, was all these big companies we worked in. I mean, your question about shareholder value versus innovation. Well, you know, when you actually go into these organizations, and I worked in 100 of them, and you discover that the people don't know how to innovate, it's not surprising that their innovative initiatives are so episodic. You know, they start these things, and then they cancel them, they start them, and they cancel them. So I think we have, part of the whole problem with this debate is people really haven't realized that they have to master a new discipline in this innovation, digital, because it moves so fast, it's so competitive. There's a whole new set of skills that are a requirement. So I'm not sure that answers your question, but...
No, I think it does. I think it does, because that change doesn't happen overnight. You just don't wake up one morning and say, everybody's going to think differently and act differently.
Well, and you need to make sure that the results you want are inevitable. That's the word stuck in my head. They had to be inevitable, or else it's episodic.
And could I call out something that, just to make, add a layer onto what Kurt was saying? People always ask me, well, where do I start? You know, as a leader, where do I start with driving more innovation? And my answer is start with your own agenda. And I think Kurt gave a brilliant illustration of this. So I often get called up by companies and they say, we're very worried about our innovation program. And I'll say, okay, send me the last 3 or 4 agendas of meetings where important people got together to talk about important stuff. And I'll get out a highlighter pen and I'll go through that agenda and look for where innovation is. You know, and all too often it's like item 27, next to, globalization board report or something. And what does that tell you? It tells you it's literally not on the agenda. What Kurt's illustrating is not only is it on the agenda, it's an obsession. It's part of every meeting. It's part of every conversation. It takes priority. And so if you really want to start somewhere, start with yourself. Start with your own agenda.
I think that's some great advice. What do you guys think about these innovation labs? Effectively, the track record on innovation labs has been anything less than stellar.
Innovation labs?
Innovation labs, yeah. Innovation labs within the company,
Yeah.
setting up a lab to kind of move forward on innovation.
We have something like that, and it's very successful because we work a lot with PhDs and people coming out of research. And I think this, what we call, or what Peter Drucker called new knowledge, scientific knowledge, is kind of a raw diamond. And the question is, if you can understand what new technology or new knowledge can have an impact on the markets you are in, and if you understand them a little bit earlier than the competition, you can, again, I think, build out a competitive advantage based on kind of a unique capability, a unique competence inside the company. So it's a small team. It's a kind of the leader is a chief scientist, the one who also was at SRI in former career. So basically, as our joint programs with NASA, and we really try to understand kind of what's up next in certain key markets, like security for us. Security software is very important in networking and on the basic software side. Other things like AI now in combination with safety, so how to combine AI technologies with functional safety and fail operational systems. Those things are not easy. They're pretty deep technical problems. Yeah? And I think the advantage of institutions like SRI or our collaborations with research institutes is that you can work on those basic groundbreaking research. And I have to say the European Commission does a pretty good job in their European Horizon programs. It's not so much talked about in the US, but I think the Horizon 2020 and Horizon Europe, that's something where we collaborate a lot with our customers and partners. So we have programs where Audi and InnovatIon and our research institutions are part of a collaborative program, and then we have 2-3 year time to think through a problem in a systematic and thorough way and can really identify, is this really knowledge we can deploy, or if we have knowledge we have to discard. But one more point to the former statements about outside and inside perspective, and I just want to bring in 2 ideas from Peter Drucker because they are, I think, spot on. Peter Drucker once said, outside is reality, inside is fantasy. And if you're an executive, I mean, you have to spend time with the outside. And this means you need to understand your markets and your customers and your technology competitive landscape. And the second one is, and this is about the innovative culture, I think if you have an innovation lab, but you're saying we are doing innovation lab, and here see Mr. Müller, he's head of innovation lab, that's completely wrong, in my opinion. I think what you need to do, and again, Peter Drucker said, culture eats strategy for breakfast. And if you want to be an innovative culture, the CEO and executive board, they need to drive innovation. And you cannot delegate this drive for innovation to an innovation lab. But you can take the benefit of understanding basic core science and technology in having some people who really can talk to really great scientists and who really can bring then basic ideas back into this more like this product cycle.
So what I think you're saying is really innovation needs to be embedded in the entire firm culture everywhere, driven
Absolutely.
From the top down.
Absolutely.
But the innovation labs could be used to incubate certain cutting edge things. Did I hear that right?
And the bridge to this really deep scientific world. We don't need to forget we have a lot of great researchers out there, and they lack access to industry. Mm-hmm. And also in Austria, we do a bad job in having professors who come out of industry or who return to industry. It's a very secluded markets. And so what we are going to do with our company, together with one of our shareholders, we are going to sponsor a chair for autonomous system and the Technical University of Vienna here, basically to have people coming out of the industry and coming back to research to work on these tough problems they understand from working on the real issues and not just dreaming about what could be the big problem to work on. Yeah.
So more interface. Kurt, you wanted to get in there because I think you have a view.
So I think that's great. And every business has a core business, and you make continuous improvements, and you have to do that sort of thing. But there really needs to be that separate function. It's incubating the new ideas and has the right structure in small teams and doing all the kinds of things you So SRI was like that. We had a core business, and we had to do incremental innovation, but we had a group like that, which is where these big ideas came from. And there were different people in them, but they all used the same basic, everybody had to do NABC, with the value proposition, to start. And that was the glue that held the whole company together. So when those innovative folks would go talk to the operations folks, they had a common language. So why does most university tech transfer fail? Universities don't know how to develop value propositions. So industry looks at it, says we don't want it. So I had a lunch with the head of tech transfer at Stanford University. I was very proud. They claim they're the best place in the world for this. Well, actually, all of their income comes from 3 patents, only 3 patents out of all the research they do. And I said, what's your problem? He said, well, my program is not successful. Well, I said, well, how do you develop value propositions? Well, we don't have a way to do that. They don't have an incubator to do that. So when you visit companies, what do? He said, well, we bring all our patents and we show it to them. What do they say to you? They say, go do more work and come back. They're not interested. You have to incubate it, and you need a process that cuts across the organization. One last quick point. So many companies put good managers in charge of their innovation process, but they don't understand innovation. So if you're going to do innovation, you put a proven innovator in that job. Otherwise, you're just fooling around, really. Steve Jobs was successful. He was a proven innovator. He let Cook do all the operations stuff, and he did innovation, right? And so often you see these big companies that episodically go up and down with innovation. And it's because the CEO, great person, great manager, great everything, except they don't understand value creation. And so it doesn't work. It's one of the biggest mistakes we see around the world.
So I would ask the panel for one piece of advice from each of you to this group on what they could do to accelerate innovation in these changing times. What would be your one recommendation, one way that we could be more successful in terms of bringing innovation to the forefront of the landscape? And George, do you want to kick it off?
I think I would look where do we believe as a go-to-market entity where the biggest bang for the buck will be. Where will we be really the biggest market, the profit pools, as they call it at McKinsey, where will be the profit pools of the future? And then I would look who of my partners and customers are most eager to capture this profit pool. And then I would try to talk to the key decision makers as these customers or partners and convince them, let's try to capture this profit pool together, because as a small company with only 1,700 people that we are having, you cannot compete with a company with 300,000-400,000 people if they really get it. So if you can convince one of the big players in the industry that they try to make an informed bet with you on a certain market opportunity, I think your risk of winning are much larger, and my strategy is to share the pie, so to say, to take kind of a smaller piece from a much larger pie, than to try to do everything on your own. Because also by having this kind of discussions with such a partner, you're also challenged. You're challenged in value proposition, you're challenged in USPs, you're challenged in competitive advantage, so you have to run through a disciplined process to win them. And I think therefore your chances to get innovation at scale are much higher with such partnerships.
Okay. Rita, how about you?
I think the first misconception you should correct is that innovation's all about getting great ideas. Sure, that's part of it. But there's the process of getting great ideas. Then there's the incubation part, which is turning those ideas into something that's actionable. And then there's acceleration, which in a large organization is the process by which you take a small innovation and scale it. And very tricky because it's a different thing. You're going from a startup to something that's a repeatable business model. And so I think remembering that there are at least these 3 parts to it: getting great ideas, incubating them, and accelerating them is all got to be managed, or your innovations will fail.
All 3 layers. Very cool. Kurt, what do you think? Your piece
of
advice?
I think we should listen to Peter Drucker. Your job is to create a customer. And there are 2 essential functions you perform: marketing and innovation. And I go into company after company after company, and the employees can't even define what innovation is. Companies are not being serious about this. If you accept the premise of Peter Drucker that it's the most important thing you do, everything else is cost, then your job is to assure that your employees are all value creators. Everybody in the company ought to be a value creator because everybody has a customer. And right now, the world and management is not taking that seriously. And the result is inadequate performance. If we could get a shift, following Peter Drucker, and why this meeting is so important every year, is it puts a focus on the customer and delivering value. If we could make that shift, so that was an assumed imperative from every CEO, every executive, whether in a tech transfer organization, a university, or a company, it would create a revolution, a disruptive revolution in performance around the world.
Well, that's a very strong statement. I was going to say pretty strong, I would say a very strong statement. I'd like to ask your support in thanking the panelists. And before we do, I just want to make sure that I leave you with the 3 key statements as I took them away from this panel. 1, digital is allowing a completely new change in the innovation landscape, having them become market makers of the future. Effectively, without value creation, innovation is nothing. It's an assembly of great ideas, but doesn't take into account the customer that needs to be in the forefront. And to do that, you need a leadership and a cultural change within the organization. And third, and certainly not least, scaling innovation is key, and no one firm can do it alone. Collaboration in the future will be absolutely critical. With that, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for a great discussion.
Thank you. That was fun.